Manna students to week 4 of our series called Now You See Me, a study in Daniel. Yes, we are in Daniel in case you've missed anything. It has been so much fun to dive into Daniel, to get to know some of these people that are in these stories of which Daniel was told. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, King Nebuchadnezzar, all of them. Through their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, all of it, we have been able to learn more about the Lord and what He is doing and how He uses our circumstances to reveal Himself to us. It has been so much fun to be studying with you. Our hope this past month is that you are better able to recognize after watching these videos or going through these messages. Our hope is that you are better able to recognize who God is and what He can do through your own circumstances in your life as well. Today, we're going to be dissecting chapter 6 of Daniel. And there's a whole lot that goes on here, a lot of lessons and ideas and things that we can learn from in chapter 6. But specifically today, our big idea is this. We can see God's provision when we trust in Him. Now, you may be thinking, it should be the opposite, isn't it? If we are to trust in God, don't we learn to trust in God through His provision for us? And while I think God can use His provision to grow our trust in Him, I honestly believe that we can learn more about God and see God better when we first trust in Him, and then He provides for us, and then He acts in some way. Let me describe this. So, trust falls, where somebody stands behind you and you fall backwards and they're supposed to trust you. The ultimate test of trust, really, if you will. The truth is you cannot fully experience the provision. You cannot fully experience the act of somebody catching you if you don't first fall. And in order to first fall, you have to have trust that they're going to catch you. It's kind of a cycle, but it is necessary to really test your trust. So now, how does this apply in chapter 6? Well, before we begin, I want to touch the base of the fact that Sam last week talked a lot about King Nebuchadnezzar. So we know now that King Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in power. So at the beginning of chapter 6, there's actually a new king, and his name is King Darius. And honestly, it looks like history is repeating itself. You see, Daniel is seen for his character, seen for his abilities, and promoted to power yet again under this new king. So the very first verse in Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be all day today. So starting in verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So there's a whole leadership breakdown for you. And I am going to explain it with some drawing. Okay, so there are 120 satraps, and I'm not going to draw all of them, but there's 120 satraps. So we have 120 satraps. Another word for satraps is actually princes. So if you read another version of the Bible, they reference these people as princes. So if we think of the idea of a prince is actually over a part of the kingdom, right? So there's 120 princes. And then from that, there are 3 high officials, of which Daniel is one. So we'll draw Daniel. Boop, 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 boop. So there's 120 satraps, and then there's 3 high officials over Daniel. Here's Daniel. And then, of course, we have King Darius, who is up here. And we'll draw a little crown for him. We have King Darius. So Daniel is part of the 3 high officials. Obviously, he is of good standing with the king to be put in that position. But he's in such good high standing with the king that King Darius actually wants to promote Daniel little arrow means promote. Promote Daniel to a position over everybody. So he would still be under King Darius's rule, but he would basically be over the entire kingdom. He would be a trusted advisor over the entire kingdom. Now, that's really cool for Daniel, right? But the thing is the satraps, or the princes, and the other high officials, they don't like that Daniel is being put ahead of them. They don't like that Daniel is being put in charge of them, and they want Daniel out of power. But they didn't know how to do it. So in verse 4, we continue to read. It says, "Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.'" So Daniel was so good. He was in such good standing, so faithful, so committed, and just such a good person. He was blameless, that they couldn't find any rule or law that could go against him to make him seem bad in the sight of the law of the land. So what they did is actually super devious, super manipulative. They devised a plan in which they could catch Daniel by using the law of God against him. So what they did is they went to King Darius, and they told King Darius that we should put a law in place that nobody should pray to any god or anything other than you for the next 30 days. And they wanted to make this an unbreakable law that if anyone were to pray, that they should be put to death. So we read that in verse 10. We will start there. It says, "Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement." This is verse 6. "Then the high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, 'O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God." So even though this unbreakable law was put in place, Daniel continues to do what Daniel has been doing, and he continues to pray. He knew he could get in trouble, but he had faith in his God that regardless of what the circumstance might be, that he would be loyal to God over his loyalty to the law of the land, and he knew that he would be protected, or he knew God would move if God was needed to move. Eventually, Daniel was caught praying, as was the entire plan's purpose, was to catch Daniel, to get against him, to force him to be punished. And the king was bound by his law to punish Daniel, so it had to happen based off this unbreakable law. Even though he didn't really want to, the king did not really want to punish Daniel, because the king was actually fond of Daniel. The king liked Daniel a lot. So in verse 14, it says, "Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. But nothing could be done. Daniel had to be punished." So the king really tried to save Daniel and couldn't. In verse 16, it says, "Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you.'" Basically, he threw him in there and wished him luck and said, if your God is real, if your God is here, then my prayer, my hope is that he will deliver you. So imagine this moment. I know none of you have been thrown into a den of lions, much like 2 weeks ago we talked about the fact that we don't often defy kings and end up in the fire. But honestly, there may be times in your life, it may even be a time right now, where it feels like there's no hope. It feels like there's no escape to be had or no faith to be had, because the situation that we're facing seems to be at a loss. It seems like there's no way out except struggle. It seems like there's no way out except hurt, and it seems like there is no escape, and it seems to be endless. Whether it's a situation that's happening with your family members or with your friends, or the fact that sports have been canceled or delayed and school is so uncertain right now. I know we're all experiencing something from this, or maybe it's even just your emotions and your anxiety, and it seems like they have no rhyme or reason and you can't figure out how to get out of it because you don't even know where it started. And in these times, it may seem impossible to have faith and trust in God, let alone that He is there, and let alone that He is going to provide a way for you to pull through the situation that you're in. But if we look to Daniel, if we can learn something from Daniel, it's this. It's that we could, before we ever are in the lion's den, before we're ever in a situation where it seems endless, our trust should be in God, that He will provide for us. You see, Daniel prayed 3 times a day, and he did that even before the unbreakable law was in place. He prayed 3 times a day. Once the unbreakable law was put in place, he most likely started praying for the law to be broken, or that God would move against the unbreakable law and make a way. But we know that through his prayers, he was caught in his prayers, and his situation got much, much worse. So we don't know what exactly happened in the lion's den when Daniel is sentenced to be punished. We don't get Daniel's perspective, but we do get King Darius's perspective, and I think it's important that we read about it. So verse 17 through 23, it says, "And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of the Lord's, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at daybreak the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, 'O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to deliver you from the lions?' Then Daniel said to the king, 'O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you. O king, I have done no harm.' Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God." Daniel trusted in God to save him. Not only that, but through his trust and through the display of God's protection and God's provision in this moment, King Darius has a response in which he praises God. So in verse 26, King Darius says, "I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel's initial trust in God is what saved him. It says that in verse 623. It says, because Daniel trusted in God, he is saved. Also from this, through Daniel's circumstances, God was able to reveal himself and reveal his power to King Darius, which is just incredible. Is through probably, well, considering Daniel, through a very difficult and scary circumstance in Daniel's life, God was able to glorify himself and reveal himself to King Darius and his power. And we see that happen through the words of King Darius in the verse we just read. But listen, there is no roadmap for your specific circumstances that you're facing. Honestly, what we can know from God's word, like we've talked about, or what we've kind of referenced this month is there isn't exactly a Bible story written about your specific circumstance, whatever you're facing, going through. But when we talk about the fact that the Bible is truth and the Bible can light the way for what we're experiencing, we're talking about this idea that from God's word, we can come to understand, from this specific story, we can come to understand that when we trust in God, He will protect and provide for us, and He can reveal His power through our circumstances, through us, through our story, and whatever that may be. Over and over again, we see the Lord moving through us. God's heart is for us, not only for us to know Him, but also for others to come to know Him through us, through His work in us. He will always protect us in uncertain times. Even when we don't seem to know what can be happening, we can trust in God that He is still looking out for our good, and He can still move even in the circumstance that we think might be endless. You see, using even our toughest situations and circumstances, God can still be glorified through them. So I want to encourage you today, if you are in one of those seasons that just seem to be endless, God is in it and God is with you. We just must trust in Him all throughout it, which I know can be difficult, but that is why we do have our small groups, is a fellowship of a group of Christians who can come alongside us through whatever we're facing. And honestly, this isn't an idea that can happen overnight. Our trust in God is something that is continuously being developed in us. So we are going to talk about this further within our small groups, through our small group questions, if you are at your student site group. If you're online, you can look below in the description to get our small group questions, and you can look at those either with some family members or some friends, or just some personal reflection. But it has been our pleasure to bring you this series this month, Now You See Me, a study in Daniel, and we can't wait until next month as we start a new series. Thanks for joining us, Manna students.